In our study of Old Testament history, we're going to end the book of Genesis today. We're in the fourth section of Joseph's life. We divide his life into three parts. He was the princely son when he was honored by his father and hated by his brothers at home. He became the patient sufferer in Potiphar's house and in Potiphar's prison. Then he became the provident sovereign when he explained and interpreted Pharaoh's dreams and gave the advice about how to take care of the 7 years of famine that lay ahead. And he became the number 2 man in the empire, the prime minister, the governor of all the land of Egypt. We saw his brothers come and he tried them bit by bit by bit until he proved themselves to be the honest and true men that they needed to be. And he revealed himself to them. They fell on each other's neck and they kissed each other and they talked for a good long while. Now I want us to move back just a little bit and read about this news reaching Pharaoh's palace and get ready for the great scene that Jacob comes to be with Joseph. Turn, if you will, in Genesis 45. Let's start with verse 16. When the news reached Pharaoh's palace that Joseph's brothers had come, Pharaoh and all of his officials were pleased. He said to Joseph, "Tell your brothers, do this. Load your animals and return to the land of Canaan, and bring your father and your families back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the fat of the land." You're also directed to tell them, do this. Take some carts from Egypt for your children and your wives, and get your father and come. Look at verse 20. Never mind about your belongings, because the best of all of Egypt will be yours. Leave everything behind. Just come with the people. I'll take care of you. They did it. He also gave to Benjamin gave to everybody some new clothing. To Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 sets of clothes. They get back to their father and they tell their father in verse 20, and by the way, Joseph told them in verse 24, don't quarrel on the way. So evidently they still were very quarrelsome with one another. And then he says in verse 26, they tell Jacob, Joseph is still alive. In fact, he's ruler of all Egypt. Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them. But when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, when he saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived, and Israel said, I'm convinced it's enough. My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. But remember, Jacob has been warned time and time again, do not go back down to Egypt. And yet now it appears as if he should. He needs a word from God. And he gets it in verse 2 of chapter 46. Read it with me. And God spoke to Israel in a vision at night and said, Jacob, Jacob. Here I am, he replied. I am God, the God of your fathers, he said. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I'll make you a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. Now watch this beautiful promise. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes. Isn't that beautiful? The son that he thought was dead, his favorite, is going to be there when he dies and close his eyes. Now Jacob goes to Egypt. Chapter 46, beginning with verse 5. Then Jacob left Beersheba, and Israel's sons took their father Jacob and their children and their wives in the carts that Pharaoh had sent to transport them. They also took with them their livestock and the possessions they had acquired in Canaan. They're not going to leave their possessions behind. And Jacob and all of his offspring went to Egypt. He took with him to Egypt his sons and his grandsons and his daughters and his granddaughters, all his offspring. We don't have all the sons, we don't have all of the children of Jacob listed because he had daughters as well as just Dinah. Starting in verse 8 and going all the way through the rest of, well, actually through verse 25, you have the sons and the grandsons of Jacob listed, and you can read those. But after they're all counted up, there are 75 in all. Your version may read by, as mine does in verse 27, they all that went down to Egypt were 70 in all, but Acts 7:14 says 75. And so does the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. The Greek version of the Old Testament says 75. So there's 75 people in Egypt that are sons and grandsons and daughters and granddaughters of Jacob when they arrive in Egypt. And they will leave over 2 million in number. What a multiplication. Verse 28. Now Jacob sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to get directions. Notice how trusting Jacob is now of Judah. Judah is becoming the number one son. He will be the one through whom Jacob's seed will be traced. When they arrived in the region of Goshen, Joseph had made his chariot ready and went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. They'd been separated for over a score of years. And now a son, that Jacob had thought was dead, is now back with his brothers. Israel said to Joseph in verse 30, "Now I'm ready to die, since I've seen for myself that you're alive." He doesn't. God's going to give Jacob 17 years to enjoy Joseph's presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, "I will go and speak to Pharaoh, and I'll say to him, my brothers and my father's household who were living in the land of Canaan have come to me. The men are shepherds. They tend livestock, and they brought along their flocks and herds and everything that they own. When Pharaoh calls you in and asks, 'What is your occupation?' you should answer, 'Your servants have tended livestock from boyhood on, just as our fathers did.' Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen. For all shepherds are detestable to Egyptians." The Egyptians did not live in the land of Goshen. The land of Goshen is all the land of the delta of the Nile. The Nile is one of those strange rivers that flows north. And where it enters the Mediterranean Sea, it parts into 3 main tributaries. And in a flat land where once a year there's 4 feet of water across all of that territory. It is a swamp land. And the Egyptians, to them the raising of cattle and sheep was a thing of a detestable thing, they would not possess that land at all. But for Jacob and his family, it was exactly the best of land. And they will become there a great nation. So, in chapter 47, Joseph went and told Pharaoh, "My father and my brothers with their herds and everything they own have come from Canaan and are now in Goshen." He chose 5 of his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. "What's your occupation?" he asked. "We're shepherds." They said, "We've come to live here a while." They know they're going back because they cannot live forever outside of promised land. "We're here to live for a while." Now we know it's going to be for over 400 years, but they don't. "Because we've come here because the famine is severe and your servants' flocks have no pasture. So now, please, let your servants settle in Goshen." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "The best of the land is before them. Whatever they want, they can have. Let them live in Goshen. And if you have any among you of special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock." This Pharaoh not only trusts Joseph, he now trusts Joseph's family. Now we need to get back to Jacob for a while. You remember earlier in studying Jacob, we talked about we'd see him finally as the seer in Egypt, as he stood before Pharaoh and as he stood before his sons and as he stood before his God. Now let's let him stand before Pharaoh and find out that Pharaoh will have to acknowledge that Jacob is the superior person. Jacob is 130 years old when I read in chapter 47, verse 7. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. After Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, "How old are you?" Before we get the answer, notice Jacob blessed Pharaoh without any dispute. The writer of Hebrews says, and this is accepted as a fact anywhere, without any dispute, the less is blessed by the greater. And Jacob blesses Pharaoh. So Jacob claims to be superior to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh acknowledges that Jacob is superior to him as he accepts this blessing. Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimages of my father." He is 130 years old. Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. He blessed him twice. He blessed him at the beginning of their conversation and then again at the end of his conversation. Jacob is seen to be superior to the ruler of all the world. Now they settle in Goshen, starting in 47 verse 11. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramesses, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food, according to the number of their children. So Joseph is now the ruler of the house. Although Jacob is still alive, Joseph is governor of the land, and Joseph is the provider for the family. Now, starting in verse 13, Joseph is going to make Pharaoh the richest man in the world. And Joseph is going to make Pharaoh the owner of all the land of Egypt. Start reading with me in chapter 47 and verse 13. And let's notice Joseph's wise business policies. He's even going to make a land purchase deal for Pharaoh. Verse 13. There was no food, however, in the whole region because the famine was severe. Both Egypt and Canaan wasted away because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan in payment for the grain they were buying. Joseph got all of the money in Egypt and Canaan. When the money of the people of Egypt and Canaan was gone, all Egypt came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? Our money is used up. We don't have any more money. We cannot buy any more grain." Pharaoh has all of the money of all of Egypt and all of Canaan in his treasury, but he doesn't give them food yet. They've still got something to buy it with. So in verse 16, he says, "Then bring your livestock," said Joseph. "I will sell you food in exchange for your livestock, since your money is gone." As long as there's means to buy, they ought to be buying. They ought not to be on the dole. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and he gave them food in exchange for their horses, their sheep and goat and cattle and donkeys. He brought them through that year with food in exchange for all of their livestock. But then that year's over in verse 18. That year is over. They come to him the following year, and they said, "We cannot hide from our Lord the fact that since our money is gone and our livestock belongs to you, there's nothing left for our Lord except our bodies and our land. Why should we perish before your eyes, we and our land as well? Buy us and our land in exchange for food, and we with our land will be in bondage to Pharaoh. Give us seed so that we may live and not die, and the land may not become desolate." He does it. So Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's. Now look at verse 21. "And Joseph reduced the people to servitude from one end of Egypt to the other. However, he did not buy the land of the priests because they received a regular allotment from Pharaoh and had food enough from the allotment Pharaoh gave them. That is why they did not sell their land." Joseph has made Pharaoh the owner of all of Egypt. He owns all the money. He owns all the livestock. He owns all the land. And all the people are his servants. So Joseph, in verse 23 of chapter 47, says to the people, "Now that I have bought you and your land today for Pharaoh, here is seed for you, and so you can plant the ground. But when the crop comes in, give a fifth of that to Pharaoh. So you may keep, and the other 4/5, you may keep as seed for the fields and as for food for yourselves and your household and your children. They're not complaining about that. Matter of fact, they say in verse 25, you've saved our lives. May we find favor in the eyes of our Lord. We will be in bondage to Pharaoh. So Joseph established it as a law that's still enforced today as Moses writes the book, that 1/5 of the produce belongs to Pharaoh. It was only the land of the priest that did not belong to Pharaoh. But I want you to notice a difference in Goshen. Egypt is being sold. Egypt is selling themselves to Pharaoh. But Israel in Goshen is being blessed. Now the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. Egypt is being cursed by the famine, but Israel is prospering during the famine. The reason for that is simple. The Nile does not dry up. And so the Nile will overflow their land and bring the rich, fertile soil of southern Africa down, northern Africa down with it, or central Africa really, down with it, and fertilize the land and water the land and grow the grain for their crops. So although they can't grow the corn to eat, their animals still can eat. Look at verse 28. Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years. Isn't that gracious of God? To give Jacob 17 years with Joseph. And the years of his life were 147. When the time drew near for Israel to die, he called for his son Joseph and said to him, if I found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh and promise that you'll show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt. Bury me where they are buried. I'll do as you say. And he leaned upon his staff and worshiped God. But now the old man knows he's about to die. And so he must now bless his sons. First of all, he calls for Joseph to come in. And in chapter 48 he says, I adopt your 2 sons as my sons. Manasseh and Ephraim will inherit in my house. Joseph now gets the double portion because both Manasseh and Ephraim will inherit in the house of Jacob. So Joseph has the birthright, the double portion. In the next chapter, we're going to find out that Judah has the blessing. Through him the seed will be traced. And he brings Manasseh, Joseph, brings Manasseh and Ephraim to Jacob for blessing. And he, Joseph, puts Manasseh in his left hand and Ephraim in his right hand, so that as he puts them out to the father's right hand will be on Manasseh and his left hand upon Ephraim, so that Manasseh will get the greater blessing, because that's Joseph's firstborn. Now it's become with Jacob sort of like it was with Isaac. He can't see too well. But he crosses his hands, and he puts his left hand on Manasseh and his right hand upon Ephraim, and he pronounces a great blessing upon them, that they'll be powerful and that they'll be called by the name of God and the name of Isaac and Abraham and Isaac, and they'll increase greatly in the land. And the angel that has been with Jacob will be with them and preserve them. And then Joseph saw that his father had put his left hand on Manasseh and his right hand on Ephraim, so he reached out to get his father's hands. And Jacob says, I know my son. I know what I'm doing. And Manasseh will be a great tribe. He will possess great land, but the younger brother will be greater than the older brother. That's so much so that the whole nation of Israel will be addressed as Ephraim in days to come. Manasseh inherits the most of the land. Ephraim only possesses a small territory, but he will be the most powerful tribe in all of Israel other than Judah. And later there'll be 2 nations, and one will be called Judah, and one will be called Ephraim. But Jacob, the main lesson, is that Jacob has adopted Manasseh and Ephraim as his sons, making Joseph the firstborn, the one with the double portion of his substance. Then Jacob calls for all of his sons to come before him. Not Manasseh and Ephraim. The 12 sons of Jacob stand before him. And he blesses them as best he can, one by one. And I imagine they are listening carefully, because one of them will be chosen to be the one through whom the seed comes. He brings Reuben in. He says in verse 3, chapter 49, verse 3, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor, excelling in power, turbulent as the waters, you will no longer excel. For you went up to your father's bed, into my couch, and defiled it. So Reuben is told, you will not have the seed traced through you, because you defile my couch. Then he speaks to two sons at once. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Are they not all brothers? Why does he say Simeon and Levi are brothers? Because they're two peas in a pod. They're just alike. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are weapons of violence. Let me not enter into their council. Let me not join their assembly. For they've killed men in their anger and hamstrung oxen as they pleased. Cursed be their anger so fierce, and their fury so cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. You remember back in Shechem, where they slaughtered the whole city and the whole tribe because of the evil done to Dinah? Because of that, Jacob says, they will not be the one I blessed. Instead, I will scatter them in Israel. Simeon receives for a time a small territory, but soon he loses it and is scattered throughout the land. And Levi never gets a territory. There are 48 Levitical cities in which the tribe of Levi will live. But they're within somebody else's land, somebody else's territory. Then he gets down to Judah in verse 8. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Judah is chosen. Was he sinless? Oh, no. You remember the deal with Tamar, how he committed fornication with his own daughter-in-law, thinking her to be a prostitute. So it wasn't because of his sinlessness. It was because of his faithfulness. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your brothers' sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, O Judah. You return from the prey, my son. Like a lion, he couches and lies down. Like a lioness, who will dare raise him up? Nobody goes into the lion's den, grabs him by the beard, and shakes him awake. If he does that, he'll remember it forever. He said, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs, and the obedience of the people is his. A single seed is promised from Judah that will conquer all of the enemies. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest vine. Notice he didn't say his horse. He didn't say his charger. He said his donkey and his colt. That's what Jesus will ride on when he comes in glory to the city of Jerusalem. He will wash his garments in wine, his robe in the blood of grapes. Judah is chosen to be the one to whom the seed comes. You read the rest of chapter 49, and you'll see him try his best to bless his sons. And after he's blessed them all, I read in chapter 49, verse 29, then he gave them these instructions. I'm about to be gathered to my fathers. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Machpelah, the cave near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham brought as a burial place. There Abraham and his wife Sarah are buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried. And there I buried Leah. So there'll be 6 buried in that grave. Then he gathered his feet up into his bed and breathed his last. Joseph went and asked for permission from Pharaoh to go and bury his father. Pharaoh not only gave permission, all of Pharaoh's officials went with them, all the way from Egypt to Palestine. So much so that when they got there and began to mourn before they put Jacob in the grave, the people of Canaan said, the Egyptians have come to give a great mourning. And they put Jacob in the grave where Isaac was and where Abraham was, and returned back to Egypt. When they got back, his brothers thought, now that our father is dead, maybe Joseph will deal bad with us and we'll be slain. And they came to Joseph and they said, while our father was alive, He said for us to tell you not to be angry with us, not to kill us, but to be kind to us. Joseph said, am I God that I would judge you? You meant evil for me, but God meant good. You don't need to worry. I will preserve you all of the days of my life. Then Joseph lived in Egypt along with his family. He died at the age of 110 years. They embalmed him and placed him in a coffin. And he had made them promise that when they went back to the promised land, not if, when they went back to the promised land, they'd carry his bones and lay them there in a grave in promised land. He died at 110. How old was he when he became the governor and the ruler of all of Egypt? 30. He ruled Egypt for 80 long years. That's longer than most people ever live, much less to be ruler of all of Egypt and all the world. That closes the book of Genesis. It really doesn't close the story, because the book of Exodus will begin with the word in the Hebrew, and. It's a continuation of this story. Everything is well. The people of God are in a beautiful place to live, seemingly in absolute and perfect peace, but they're not in promised land. And the covenant with Abraham can only be fulfilled when these people are back in the land of promise. We'll begin their journey home next time.